Well, it's a real pleasure to be here because I was thinking about Christmas lectures, and when I was your age, I think it was 1968, I went to a similar lecture when for the first time I heard about microchips, and this engineer was saying how they could revolutionize engineering and electronics. And it sounded quite credible at the time. And of course, he was right, and that's why you have to turn off your mobile phones, because that's one of the key technologies there. But it made me reflect on the fact that 40 years on, I'm still here, remembering it. And so I hope all of you in 40 years will be looking back on this lecture. And the ones who don't pay attention may not be. So that's an incentive to you. So I'm going to talk about drugs without the hot air. This book, by the way, has anyone read it? Anyone got it? That's terrible. I mean, you can read, you can buy books in Manchester still, can you? I mean, I don't know. It's not just a London thing, huh? Well, buy it for your parents, and then when they ask you what the words mean, you'll say, oh, I heard the lecture, and I know. And it's only a tenner, and all the proceeds go to this charity I've set up to tell the truth about drugs. How many of you follow me on Twitter? So by the end, you're allowed to use your phone to follow me, but that's it, all right? So let's start with a question. This is a Londoner, by the way. Has anyone heard of Amy Winehouse out here? Yeah. Okay, good. So what did Amy Winehouse die of? Did she die of a drug overdose? Who thinks a drug overdose? And who thinks an alcohol overdose? And who thinks both? Yeah, okay, so most of you think both because you probably thought she took drugs and alcohol, which she did, but she died actually of an alcohol overdose. That was all that killed her. But that's not generally well known because the people don't want you to know that. The drinks industry is quite keen that young people don't realize alcohol kills, and they don't want it to be known that alcohol killed Amy. But of course, there's also a paradox in those questions, because every one of those answers is right. Because alcohol is a drug. And again, that's something that many of you, well, obviously you all know that, but I guess a lot of you probably don't think about it in those terms. And there she is being carried out of her house. Now, Amy's death was interesting for a number of reasons, one of which was that she was cured. According to current government policy, she met the criteria for recovery. She was a recovered alcoholic. But like many people who recover from addictions, alcohol, heroin, being recovered abstinent makes you more vulnerable when you relapse. And she died with a blood alcohol level that wouldn't normally have killed her. It would kill most of you, so I don't recommend trying it, but normally people who drink very heavily become more tolerant. And she didn't realize, or maybe she did, but she couldn't control herself, that relapsing to drinking when you've been lost your tolerance, when you've been abstinent for 6 weeks as she was, means you're more vulnerable. And so she died with a blood alcohol that would not normally have killed her. But the really sad sad aspect of Amy's death is not just that we lost a great talent, but the fact that we haven't used the opportunity for death to warn people about the dangers of alcohol. So, how many of you are doing science at A-level? Ah, fantastic. So what is a drug? Okay. And who should say what a drug is? Well, one of the problems we have in understanding the harms of drugs is that there is an enormously powerful lobbying organization called the drinks industry, which is trying to persuade people like you that alcohol is not a drug. Say no to drugs, that way you'll have more time to drink. And that works. And in fact, you've heard of the Warehouse here? Yes, the club? Well, since the PMA death 3 weeks ago, they've noticed a massive increase in drinking and a lot more violence from alcohol as people are scared away from drugs like ecstasy to drink. So there's been a systematic attempt over the last 30 years by the drinks industry to encourage people to drink rather than take other drugs. And drink is not safe, as I've just shown you. It killed Amy. This is my definition of what a drug is, something a politician once used but now regrets. And it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's interesting to reflect on how politicians deal with this question, because it tells you quite a lot about them. Jackie Smith, the Home Secretary, with whom I locked horns over the question of whether horse riding was more dangerous than ecstasy, when she became Home Secretary, was asked the question, did you take drugs? And instead of saying, yes, I drink every night, she said, I smoke cannabis, but I didn't enjoy. And you think, well, why would you bother, Jackie? You know, I mean, what's the point of doing something you don't enjoy? And I think the answer probably was that you had to do that to get into the Labour Party in Oxford at the time, but I don't know. And then David Cameron said when he became head of the Tory party, I did things when young that I shouldn't have. We all did. Now, that is called the Eton we, and it refers to the Tory front bench. And the great thing about David is that he may not tell us what he did, but we know. We know from his teachers and we know from his friends. And David's preference were for drugs that began with the same letter as his surname. You can work that one out. And some politicians are honest. Tim Yeo, a man of many mistresses, said, I used cannabis and I liked it. And undoubtedly some people do. And of course there's Boris, the would-be saviour of the world, who said it's an outrageous slur. Of course I've taken drugs. And I've never known him deny the fact he still is. But we'll... So what I would say is this. As a scientist, I'd say that a drug is a chemical which, when taken, produces physiological changes. And in the context of the discussion today, we're interested in the changes that it produces in the brain. Most people take drugs because they make them feel better or different or more improved in some way. But of course, drugs are also potentially damaging. And the drug laws are created supposedly to minimize the harms of drugs. So we need to know about the harms. And here are two examples of deaths from drugs. Now, the one on your right is a girl called Leah Betts. Any of you heard of Leah Betts? Yeah, a few of you, older people, have heard of Leah Betts. It's interesting. So she died on her 18th birthday, or just soon after. And she died of water poisoning after taking MDMA. She took 2 tablets, probably about 80 milligrams, on her 18th birthday. Didn't understand the health message, which was if you were dehydrated to drink water. But she wasn't dehydrated. She was just getting a parents' house organised for her 18th birthday party. She felt unwell on the MDMA and she drank 7 litres of water, and eventually she died of brain edema. Essentially she died of water poisoning. The other guy you'd never heard of either, Gavin Britton. Gavin Britton's a student at a university called Exeter University. He was in the golf team, and after a golf match with another university, he engaged in a drinking game. And so my first message to all of you today is that drinking games are really stupid and dangerous, and under no circumstances be forced into them. Because Gavin was in this drinking game. At the end of the first round, he lost it, and the forfeit was to drink more, which meant he was more drunk, so he lost the second round, so they made him drink more. And by the end of the third round, he was dead. But what's different about these 2 deaths is the fact that Leah Betts, that's a billboard. That is a picture of her on an advertising hoarding. And these were spread all around Britain to warn people of the dangers of ecstasy. And there's Gavin, that's just a little clip in the local newspaper down in Devon. And what's, to my mind, quite dishonest about these 2 deaths, is that people are scared off, were trying to be scared off by the drinks industry. And so they paid for these adverts to be spread out all over the country to scare people off drugs like ecstasy. But they adamantly refused to say anything about the harms of alcohol. And alcohol kills 3 young people a week in this country, simply from alcohol poisoning, whereas ecstasy, maybe 1 a month. If we look at the death rates from drugs, we see that by far and away the drug that is killing the most people is tobacco. 80,000 deaths a year, largely middle-aged to older people, your parents' generation, but some of you will smoke, and half of all smokers die of a smoking-related disorder. Alcohol kills about 8,000 in this country, opiates about 1,000, paracetamol about 200, cocaine about 180, and then cannabis, ecstasy, methadone, virtually no one. And one of the paradoxes that I find really quite challenging, and one of the reasons I got sacked, was for pointing out to the government that most of their interest seemed to be centered around drugs which don't do any harm, like cannabis and ecstasy. And I thought that was a deliberate ploy to avoid tackling the big problems, which are tobacco and alcohol. And alcohol is a particularly big problem for young people. Now, this is the most chilling graph that I have seen in my life as a doctor. And this graph shows a phenomenon or a metric called standardized mortality rates. And you look at these are death rates from a whole range of different disorders. You can read them up there, the different colours. And you can see all the colours but red go down. They're anchored at 100 in 1971. And over the last 40 years, the likelihood of anyone dying of all those different disorders, diabetes, respiratory disorders, heart disease, etc., have gone down, some to a third of what they were before. And that is because we as a population are healthier and because medicine's better. So it's kind of paradoxical that liver disease has gone in the other direction. And we have seen a 5-fold increase in deaths from liver disease, with a very sharp takeoff back in the early 1990s. And 80% of that increase is due to alcohol and 20% is due to viral hepatitis. Now that's a tidal wave of deaths. In fact, in your generation, particularly the men of you in the audience, you're more likely now to die of liver disease from alcohol than you would die of heart disease. And we do nothing about it because our last health secretary didn't even believe that rise really existed. And now alcohol is the leading cause of death in men between the ages of 16 and 50 in this country. So looking around this room, I reckon 5 of you are going to die prematurely before the age of 50 of alcohol. All I suggest is you don't do it before you've got your degree. And the reason we have this massive rise in liver deaths from alcohol is because you, as a population, and I'm sure you're pretty typical, are drinking very heavily from a very early age. So here we have data going back over pretty much the last 20 years. We're looking at the proportion of 15 to 16-year-olds who are intoxicated with alcohol at least once a month. Now, you see it's 54% of girls and 50% of boys in the current data, and that's been pretty much the same for the last 20 years. And that's why we have this massive rise in liver deaths, because you as a generation are drinking very much too heavily. So half of you are drinking to a point where you're damaging yourself once a month, and that will translate into liver damage over the next 20 years. So alcohol, far and away, the most damaging drug to your generation. I get a lot of interest in the press. Every week they ring me up and say someone's shown that cannabis damages the brain, or ecstasy damages the brain, or cocaine damages the brain. And I say, well, they might do, but there's not really strong evidence. But I can say categorically from my own patients, there's 4 of my patients there, the bottom brains, and the top 4 are control people of the same age. The one drug that really damages the brain is alcohol. You can see how shrunken those bottom brains are, how big the gaps, the ventricles are, particularly in the second one along. And these are people in treatment. They're not dying, they've just got chronic brain damage from alcohol. Those brains are more damaged than the average patient with Alzheimer's disease. And alcohol doesn't just damage the liver and the brain, it damages many organ systems, and it's associated with a significant proportion. About 6% of all cancers are due to alcohol. Now what you see here are 15 graphs, and each of those graphs shows the relationship between the consumption of alcohol in that direction and the likelihood of dying of one of those diseases. And you can see, for instance, the top left one, pharyngeal oral cancer, very strong relationship between alcohol intake, both in men and women. Liver cancer, cirrhosis here, quite a strong relationship. But they're all positive. The relationships are either linear or curvilinear. And there's only one that doesn't show an inevitable increase with alcohol, and that's the top right one there. And that is the so-called J-shaped curve. Now, there is a myth going around that alcohol is actually beneficial as a health in terms of preventing this ischemic heart disease in men. And that's the size of the effect. You can see it there. That's the J. It's not very steep. In fact, it's a rather, the effect is not only small, the amount of alcohol that you should take if you really believe in that and you want to optimize the health benefits of alcohol, if you're a man in the middle age, is 1/3 of a unit. You can't buy 1/3 of a unit in a bar or a pub. So what I say to you then, those of you who really believe that there might be a health benefit for alcohol, is buy 1 pint and 3 straws. And that way, not only will you optimize the benefit, you will minimize your consumption and make friends as well. But there's a serious point here. That purported benefit from alcohol, that top right-hand corner, that was sufficient for the last Labour government to say we cannot adjudicate on the harms of alcohol. We cannot change alcohol policy because there are benefits and there are harms. And that is an example of how politicians are totally corrupted by the drinks industry, because they look for any excuse to allow the status quo. And to think that that offsets all those other harms is truly bizarre. And alcohol does much more than just kill people. It kills the planet. So the largest environmental disaster before the Gulf oil spill was the Exxon Valdez. There it is, just before the drunk captain drove her into the Alaskan coast and wiped out a few thousand miles of flora and fauna. And even Ascot is not immune from alcohol violence, nor will you be. And there's no doubt alcohol is strongly associated with dangerous violence at all levels of society. And it's particularly implicated in violence in relationships. The majority of spousal abuse is due to alcohol, and a lot of child abuse. And even Parliament is not immune. There you have it. There's a Labour MP, no longer an MP, arrested after getting drunk and fighting with a Tory in Parliament. So alcohol has a very damaging effect, and many of you here will get arrested for drunk driving or for fighting, undoubtedly. Now, I want to contrast that with cannabis, because I got sacked. The main reason I got sacked was saying that actually cannabis is less harmful than alcohol. That's the Home Secretary who sacked me, Alan Johnson. I'm the guy with a moustache in the spliff there. And just look at the evidence. I showed you that increase in liver deaths, didn't I? 5-fold increase in liver deaths. You probably noticed on the slide that I said, in fact, the consumption of alcohol over the last 40 years has gone up by about 60%. So it's maybe just doubled in heavy drinkers. And we've got a 5-fold increase in liver deaths. Let's look at what happened with cannabis over the same period. Over the same period, we've seen a 20-fold increase in cannabis use. So you might imagine that if cannabis was associated with any harms, you'd see significant changes if there's 20 times more people using it. But as I showed you, there's no evidence of, well, there's almost no deaths from cannabis. So are there any other harms? Well, the government was very exercised by the last election and was desperate to reclassify cannabis to show that they were harder on drugs than the Tories. And they scrabbled around to find evidence of harm, and they came up with the idea that maybe it could cause schizophrenia. And we show them these data. This is the Medical Research Council data looking at the prevalence and incidence of psychosis, the top 2 lines, and schizophrenia, the bottom 2 lines, over the period when that rising use of cannabis might be expected to translate into some alteration in psychotic symptoms or schizophrenia. And there's no impact. If anything, schizophrenia and psychosis are going down. And if you really wanted to believe there was a link, let's believe there's a link. Let's say there's only one study that actually can show there's a link. But if we take that one study, which is a Swedish conscript study, and we say, then if you take that data, what you have to do is you've got to stop 5,000 young men or 7,000 young women from ever smoking cannabis to prevent 1 case of schizophrenia. Now, that is not a tenable, tractable public health problem at all. It's just a waste of time. Nevertheless, the government was absolutely determined to be hard on drugs, and it decided to reclassify from Class C to Class B. And the conundrum that leaves us with is this. About half of young people try cannabis. Probably at least half of you here, you will, but by the time you leave university, it'll be more like 2/3. Very few experience health harm. There's very little harm to society. And the current policy criminalizes people who will not be harmed. So we're criminalizing people to try to stop them getting an illness they won't get. But in the meantime, we are destroying careers because we're getting people criminal records. There are 1 million young people in this country who have criminal records for cannabis possession. They are an underclass. They find it very hard to get jobs in medicine or teaching or the civil service. And so my second message to you will be this. If you're going to smoke cannabis, don't get caught. Because the criminal record will do you more damage than the drug. I would say that's unjust. I think it's outrageous, personally. It's absolutely despicable. No other country in the Western world has done it the way we have, other than America, where they go even further and have 600,000 people in prison for cannabis offences. One of the reasons we have so many people in this country with convictions is because Jackie Smith, the Home Secretary, decided to incentivize the police to catch people with cannabis. And she did it successfully, you see. Over those 4 years of incentivization, almost double the numbers of people convicted each year. The easiest arrest for any policeman anywhere in Britain is to go and stop a young black guy and see if they got cannabis on them. And the chances are they might find something. And if they don't, they might plant it. So it's a really very easy arrest. And it's created enormous tensions between young people, particularly young black people, because there's this massive, massive racial distortion in terms of the criminalization. And what's weird is that 100 years ago, the most powerful woman in the world, Queen Victoria, was using cannabis regularly. She used it for period pains, she used it for the pains of childbirth. And in my more mischievous moments, I wonder whether she had so many children because she used it at other times as well, but I don't know about it. So 100 years ago, well actually, of course, the reason it was so popular 100 years ago because the British Empire was built largely on selling drugs like cannabis to Indians and opium to the Chinese, but that's another story. Here we are today. The criminalization of cannabis users produces thousands of examples like this, and I get many people writing to me saying, can you help me? So here's an example. A Scottish ex-teacher in a wheelchair, multiple sclerosis, uses cannabis because it's the only thing that gives her relief. 3 times in the last few years, the police have smashed down her front door on a dawn raid. It's weird, really, isn't it? Because she's in a wheelchair. She can't exactly jump out the window. And if they rang the bell, she'd let them in. But the absurdity and the obscenity of having a war on drugs, which is what we have been having in this country, is it allows people to take extraordinarily aggressive measures against relatively innocent users. And the position she's in now is that having 3 convictions and 4 front doors is that if the police convict her again, she must go to prison. So her life is in the hands, because she still uses, because nothing, you can't expect her to stay in chronic pain all the time. So her life effectively is in the hands of the police. If they go in once more, she'll have to go to prison. And I would ask you this question. Is this what we want our society to be like? Well, I mean, I don't. I find that appalling, utterly ridiculous. Cannabis is one of the oldest medicines in the world. It should never have been made illegal in the first place. And we should not be actively criminalizing users who don't have any alternative. There's a much better way of dealing with cannabis use. And this is called what I call the Eton experiment. You recognize young David Cameron. You probably won't recognize Josh Astor. These are 2 very privileged men who were together at Eton, which is a school near London. And they used to smoke cannabis together. And there's a very interesting experiment was done by the headmaster there. because he discovered that groups of boys were going into London and buying UB40 records and adding something else brown to the brown bags they were bringing the records in. And because David Cameron had only smoked and not sold the drugs, he was actually not thrown out of school. So the headmaster decided to adjudicate on this. In fact, he was fined, he was gated, which meant he wasn't allowed to go to Betty's tea shop on Saturdays. And he was given a Georgic, which is copying out large, hundreds of lines of Latin. Now, he won't tell us what the lines were, he may have forgotten them, but I think I know what they were this. And I think that is an extraordinarily sensible approach to young people using cannabis. Make them write lines. The experiment was this. 7 boys were expelled, including Astor. 3 were suspended, 5 were suspended, and 4 were gated. Now, I haven't been able to follow up the careers of all of them, but by and large, people who get kicked out of school for drug offences tend not to do well. And in fact, Astor has had a very problematic life ever since, with multiple drug offences. And that is obviously almost inevitable, because if you're kicked out of school, what else is there to do but deal drugs? However, the headmaster saw something in Cameron. He said he was the most difficult boy I've ever taught. And he kept him on, so he was then able to go on to other things. Now, the question you have to address is whether the headmaster right. Would Britain be a better place if Cameron had been expelled? In which case he wouldn't have gone to Oxford and he wouldn't be Prime Minister. And I'm going to leave you to make that judgment yourself. I'm neutral on that one. I don't think he should have been expelled, and he wasn't. But history might have been different if he was. And it would definitely be if you get expelled. When he became a politician, he was actually quite sensible about drugs, because he was quite drug experienced. And he opposed the banning of raves by the previous Home Secretary, Howard, possibly because his girlfriend was quite a big raver. She went to Bristol University. And he was quite sensible about ecstasy. And he wrote a report in 2004 which said the United Nations controls on drugs were not working and they should be changed. It was a great report. We thought there was hope. But as soon as he became the leader of the Tory party, he went from David to Dave, which I resent because I'm a Dave and he's definitely too posh to be a Dave. And the day he became leader of the Tory party, he retracted his views. And now he's putting through a drug bill which is essentially saying that addiction is just a lifestyle choice. And we don't bother to treat it. We don't need psychiatrists trained in addiction. We simply tell people to stop using. And this, I think, is really both misguided and very dangerous for the reasons I mentioned already with Amy Winehouse. Stopping people using without proper relapse prevention can lead to death. But I think also it shows a pervasive lack of understanding. And it comes from this peculiar privilege that Etonians have, which is that they can join a club in Oxford called the Bullingdon Club. There they are. There's Cameron, there's Boris. It's quite a difficult club to get into. You guys have got no chance. Or you girls, certainly. They don't have girls in it. The uniforms cost about 10 grand and have to be replaced after every drinking match because they get damaged. But these people, these very privileged people, were using a lot of drugs, a lot of alcohol at university, but then they get into positions of power and they stop without much of a problem. And they, I think, believe that anyone can stop, just like them. And they assume, therefore, that drug addicts, as exemplified on the lower image, are just like them, but they're not. And it's quite wrong to extrapolate from privilege to poverty. Now, over the years, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand how best to assess the harms of drugs, and I've come up with a very sophisticated matrix of 16 different harms, and I won't go through it, but that covers everything a drug can do to you, from killing you to destroying the rainforests in Colombia, where cocaine is being grown. And when you take all those 16 parameters and assess them in a very sophisticated way, you come up with this final rating of drug harms in the UK. And you can see there alcohol is the most harmful drug. It's the most harmful drug because of the very big red histogram. And that red histogram is the harms that alcohol does to other people. The damage, the violence, the road traffic accidents, the crime, etc. It's not the most harmful drug to the user. The next ones along, which are crack, heroin, and crystal meth, are the most harmful to the user. But because alcohol is so pervasive in our society, it is the most damaging drug in the UK today. In fact, every taxpayer in this country pays £1,000 of their tax goes simply to allowing the way we drink today, which if you're not a drinker, I would be very resentful of paying. There is no correlation between the harms of drugs and the control of drugs under the Misuse of Drugs Act whatsoever. 0.04, zero correlation. Which tells us three things. It tells us the law is incorrect because it's supposed to be based on drug harm, and an incorrect law is therefore an unjust law, as exemplified by 1 million young people with cannabis convictions. The law itself probably adds to harm because prohibition can lead to perverse harms like AIDS and other infections through dirty needles. And this is something I've become very exercised by in recent years, the laws actually impede research and treatment. So people like you or your parents are being denied access to potential treatments because the law won't allow them to be researched. One of the reasons the law is so perverse is that the media have a great interest in distorting evidence. And I want to talk you through this. This is a beautiful piece of work done by Alistair Forsyth. He looked at every coroner's report in Scotland in the 1990s. He found all the ones in which a drug other than alcohol was present at death, 2,255. And then he went through every single newspaper in Scotland for 10 years to see which drug deaths were reported. And 1 in 4 got reported. But the fascinating thing was that there was a remarkable variation in the likelihood of reporting depending on the drug. So only 1 of the 265 paracetamol deaths got reported. And one can almost guarantee that every one of those people died of paracetamol poisoning. 1 in 72 morphine deaths. Rarer deaths, like amphetamines, maybe half of those people died of amphetamines. 1 in 3 got reported. Cocaine, 1 in 8. Heroin, 1 in 5. Methadone, 1 in 16. But the drug that always got reported was ecstasy. So one of the reasons people think ecstasy is dangerous is because that's all the newspapers talk about. And that distortion goes right through decision-making in the Home Office and in government. And it persists today. So those are the 1990s. This is what happened recently with mephedrone. MCAT, I think you guys up here call it bubbles, but actually no one knows what bubbles is, but it's probably some mephedrone at sometimes. And this was a fantastic example of how the police and the media collude to get attention to themselves and also distort thinking about drugs. One of the most surreal conversations in my life was when I got a phone call in Barcelona from CNN. And I then interviewed them 2 days before about mephedrone. And they said, David, where's Scunthorpe? I said, well, why do you want to know where Scunthorpe is? And they said, because the Humberside police have called an international press conference to tell the world about 2 deaths from mephedrone. I said, well, that's almost impossible because we know about 450,000 Israelis have been using mephedrone for the last 2 years and no one has died. It's inconceivable there are 2 deaths one evening in Scunthorpe. But anyway, I said, go up the M1, 5 hours, turn right. That's from London, by the way, not Manchester. And I don't know if they did it, but if they got to Scunthorpe, they'd have heard this young lad's dad saying, the Red, Nick's dad, weeping as he urged youngsters to avoid the drug. I don't want him to be labelled a druggie because he wasn't. He was on a night out with his friends, enjoying himself. A normal, caring, hard-working lad. Now, every one of those words in that statement is correct, apart from the one that I've made it easy for you to detect by bolding it. Because he was a druggie. He was an alcohol druggie. And he'd been out on a Sunday night with his mates, 6 bars, drunk so much that they wandered out and then took methadone, not mephedrone, and they died as a consequence. But even though mephedrone hadn't killed them, the claim that by the police that it might have, and the newspaper hysteria got the drug banned. And that sadly, is an atrocious example of unevidence-based decision-making and policy-making. Now, one of the paradoxes about mephedrone is that mephedrone achieved something that I had failed to achieve in my 10 years trying to direct drug policy. So you see that red line of deaths from cocaine. Cocaine is not safe. It was progressively killing more people each year, and nothing we, the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, or the government could do could stop that. And then mephedrone hit the market, cleaner, safer, and people switched. And for the first time, cocaine deaths fell. So you had a 40% reduction in cocaine deaths as people switched to a safer alternative. And that's, of course, what you predict. If people use safer drugs, like methadone is safer than heroin, this is what you predict. And you could argue that methadone has actually saved more lives than it's killed. But it's still illegal, and no one knows what's going to happen then. One of the perverse effects of banning drugs is that more dangerous ones emerge. And we've seen this, you've seen this. Manchester's been certainly the site of several deaths from PMA or PMMA to closely related drugs, which are much more toxic alternatives to methadone or naphthalene, as subsequently followed methadone. So banning drugs often leads to new drugs coming along, of which we know much less and of which may be much more harmful. And we've seen this for the last 100 years, that prohibition leads to more dangerous use of other drugs. And I think now it's time for enlightenment, and I hope in your lifetime you'll see it, because many banned drugs have potentials as treatments. And here they are: cannabis, pain, spasticity, nausea, weight loss, insomnia, MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for depression, cluster headaches, LSD for helping people die in peace, ketamine for depression and pain. You heard yesterday, did you, that the government's going to make ketamine a Class B drug, but it also wants to make ketamine a Schedule II drug, which means it'll be much harder to use as a treatment for depression or pain. And mephedrone was actually being developed as a treatment for addiction. And amazingly, it worked. It reduced cocaine deaths, although it could never be prescribed now. And I think that the banning of these drugs, which has gone on now progressively for the last 50 years, is the worst censorship of research almost in the history of the world. Now, you're all scientists, and I will challenge you to think of a worst example of the censorship of research. I can only think of one, and that's when the Catholic Church banned the telescope back in 1616, because it allowed people to discover the truth about the circuit of the planets around the sun. If you want to read more about it, there's a little blog of mine in Scientific American last week, which will also make reference to some of my earlier writings this year about it. So a few years ago, I'd said enough's enough, and we ought to start researching these banned drugs because they are intrinsically fascinating. You know, why does psilocybin in magic mushrooms cause hallucinations? Fascinating question from a scientific perspective. But also, psilocybin is a possible treatment for depression and OCD. So there it is, there are the magic mushrooms. Psilocybin is a short-acting psychedelic. It works on 5-HT2A receptors in the brain, and these are intriguing receptors because the brain is loaded with these receptors, and we don't know why they're there. All we do know is that if you stimulate them, you get psychedelic effects. So they're really interesting from that perspective. Maybe they're related, not something to do with schizophrenia or psychosis or something. So we did the study, the first ever study of psilocybin on brain imaging ever in the world. We gave it intravenously because it's too expensive, because it's illegal to use it orally. We can't use mushrooms themselves because we're not allowed to. And we got remarkable changes. Now, these are brains, those are images, those are MRI images of the brain, and the colors are changes in brain activity produced by the drug. And for those of you who don't know what the coloring scheme is, if you see these images and they're blue, where the blue blobs are, there's less brain activity. And if there were red blobs, there'd be more brain activity. And you can see there's only blue blobs. And certainly I didn't expect psilocybin to switch off the brain. I thought when people are seeing all sorts of pretty coloured patterns in front of their eyes, they might turn on the visual cortex. But no. In fact, there's no visual effect at all, really. Psilocybin switches off the brain. And it disconnects the brain, and the reason people hallucinate, we think, is because the brain is normally constraining the way you see the world, and when you switch off the hubs which control that organization, you actually see things differently. But as a psychiatrist, I was particularly interested in this observation, that the front part of the brain that controls depression is also switched off. And that we found interesting, because often people, after they take mushrooms, and some of our volunteers said they felt quite a lot better, a more sense of well-being after using it. And we looked at the literature and we discovered that many antidepressant treatments switch off that part of the brain. So we then wrote a grant to the MRC to do the study. Let's see if people who don't get better with other drugs might get better with psilocybin. Well, we got the money 18 months ago. We still haven't been allowed to use the drug yet, because the regulations around illegal drugs are so ridiculous that even when you've got MRC money to use them, you may not be able to even possess the drug, which is quite paradoxical. I've been working with heroin for the last 20 years. No problems using heroin, which is a much more dangerous drug, but it's not illegal in the same sense as psilocybin. And then I want to finish by talking about the Channel 4. Did any of you see the Channel 4 program? Any of you see the C4 program, Drugs Live? Yeah. You do have television up here, yeah? Yeah. Good. It was in colour as well. So there's Jon Snow with a pill. I don't know what the pill is. It wasn't the ecstasy we used. This was an amazing study. It's the most downloaded program ever on Channel 4. Because ecstasy is so controversial, we were never able to get money from any of the traditional funding bodies to study it. Because they'd say, well, we don't want to study a recreational drug. And I'd say, well, 500,000 people in Britain use it every weekend. Didn't we ought to know what it does? And they say it's too sensitive to work with. And eventually Channel 4 came to me, and they came to me actually, and they said they wanted to make a program to show brain science and drugs. And I said, great, that's what I do. And they said, we want you to do cocaine live. And I said, no, actually, no, I'm not interested, because I know what cocaine does. That's not really very relevant to my research. So they went away, and a month later they came back and said, okay, well, what would you do live? I said, ecstasy, because it's never been done. 30 years of massive use worldwide, no one's ever done a study to find out what it does in the brain. So we got Channel 4 funded a proper scientific study, which we added a few extras to, so they could be on TV. And I'm interested in ecstasy because of the potential it has to help people with chronic, severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, there's an amazing statistic. More returning soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan have committed suicide from untreated PTSD than have died in combat. Modern war essentially is not war anymore. Modern war is a chronic state of trauma, the sense of fear of going to be blown to pieces by a bomb, watching your friends blown to pieces by bombs, by an enemy that you don't see and don't understand, and fighting for a cause that doesn't make any sense. And then you come back and no one likes you, and so you kill yourself. And it seems to me that's not pretty rough on the soldiers, particularly young soldiers. And a study was done a couple of years ago that took patients with PTSD who weren't getting better after true treatments and randomized them either to MDMA or to placebo. Now, the way MDMA is used in these experiments is you essentially get a dose and you get a psychotherapeutic session to help you deal with the trauma while you're under MDMA. And you do that twice, about 3 weeks apart. And in order to get over traumas, people have to re-engage with the memory and use the memory and use cognitive approaches to the memory to suppress the emotions. Because you've all got bad memories. You've all been traumatized at some stage in your life. But mostly it doesn't disrupt you because the emotional element is you can keep under control. But people with PTSD, they can't. And my feeling was that MDMA probably helps dampen down the emotion so people can properly engage and get cognitive control over the trauma. And it worked. Here you have it. A very large proportion of the people who were treated with MDMA got better, the placebo group not so. So here's powerful treatment. So how does it work? Well, it carries on working. So here it is, the first ever MDMA brain imaging study, paid for by Channel 4. Well, the first thing you see, it's all blue again. Again, no one could possibly have predicted that, because you might think that the stimulant effects would actually turn on the brain. But no, it's all turned off where it's turned off. It's not everywhere. Localized turning off, but not different places to psilocybin. Not the cortex, oops. Not up in the cortex at the top here, but down here in what's called the limbic system and the midbrain, the emotional centers of the brain. And that is probably why it works, why it reduces anxiety, and why it helps people live with bad memories. So here you see the magnitude of the negativity of bad memories, even in our normal volunteers who don't have PTSD, was dampened down by MDMA. And we're able to show where in the brain that dampening down occurs, and it's in emotional centers. So we think now we have a neuroscience of emotion that explains why MDMA might be useful as a treatment, and one just hopes that that will help people be able to use it therapeutically. Now, there are many, many things we can do to make more rational use of drugs and reduce the risks of young people like you losing drugs. I'm not going to go through all these. They're all in the book. They're all proven. These are all internationally proven approaches to reduce harms. We can also use science to address important questions about how we might reduce the harms of other drugs like tobacco. This is an analysis we just did a couple of months ago looking at the relative harms of different tobacco products, showing that cigarettes are way, way more harmful than electronic delivery systems like e-cigarettes. It strongly suggests that we should be investing in these new delivery systems rather than allowing people to smoke cigarettes. We can also go further. Modern science would allow us to make a safe alcohol. Alcohol can never be safe. You can never find any antidotes to alcohol, because alcohol is metabolized always in the liver, and it's always metabolized to a toxin called acetaldehyde. So it's impossible to drink alcohol without damaging yourself. Whereas we could replace alcohol with a safe alternative if we were allowed to. And I think this would be to alcohol what electronic cigarettes will be to nicotine. They will seriously reduce the harms. 6 million people a year in the world die of tobacco, and 3 million of alcohol. So you take all those deaths out, that would be more deaths than AIDS, malaria, meningitis, tuberculosis. Now, I haven't given you much advice, but I'm going to give you 2 pieces of advice now. The first is, don't do drugs when you're drunk. Many of the deaths we see are people who have been drunk, like the Scunthorpe 2, and then have made errors of judgment in what they take, either not knowing what they were taking or not understanding the difference between drugs. So, really important, don't do drugs when you're drunk. And if you do use illegal drugs, which of course a lot of you will, minimize the risks and don't get caught, because the risks of criminalization really will screw over your life. And I'll stop now. I'll remind you that is a brilliant book for your parents, and buy it for your brothers and sisters as well if you want. But just make sure you read it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, David. That was enlightening to say the least. Questions? We've got 20 minutes. David will take any questions from you. If you feel at the end you want to ask any personal questions, then you can come down and have a chat to him. But questions from the floor, first of all.
Yeah.
Has cannabis ever killed him?
That's a really interesting question. There is one coroner's report from Mid Wales about 10 years ago saying that the death was due to cannabis, but we haven't been able to ascertain how he came to that conclusion. So that's absolutely right. That's one of the reasons we've argued strongly that cannabis is safer than alcohol, because 3 young people a week die of alcohol poisoning, and about 10 a week die of the consequences of being drunk, like driving their car into another car or getting their heads kicked in by one of their drunk friends. And cannabis doesn't do that, and so it's intrinsically safer than alcohol.
Have you ever taken a drug?
Never. No, I've used drugs all the time, actually, yes. I've been subject to all sorts of experiments. I try not to take illegal drugs because GMC would be really hard on me. So I'm afraid I'm just allowed to drink alcohol. But what I would say to you is this, and this is a very serious point. One of the reasons I'm arguing this case is that when I get to a point where I might need a drug, like if I'm dying or if I've got cancer and I want to use something like cannabis or LSD, I don't see why I shouldn't be allowed it. I don't see why people should have to break the law to get it for me. So I'm quite keen to be in a position where I can make that choice. At present, I can't. At the back there. Say again? They get liver failure. It's a liver toxin. So they die of liver failure, and then they either get transplanted or mostly they just die.
In your lecture, you were speaking about how it's good to, in terms of legalizing certain substances, you should be promoting scientific study towards them. Wouldn't you say it's going to be more effective to actually relinquish the hold of the drink industry over the political system?
Totally. The drinks industry has been an extraordinary, destructive, manipulative industry, and it is fought. I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, the quality of their dissembling and their dishonesty is remarkable. I mean, if any of you have seen the film Thank You for Smoking, it's a brilliant film. It's how you can justify smoking. The drinks industry have seen that film and they're maybe the most sophisticated industry in the world in terms of avoiding telling the truth, avoiding confronting the issues, and they have systematically tried to avoid any competition by keeping politicians seduced by what they get and from the drinks industry, and therefore being hard on other drugs. So my view is this: that I'm not a legalizer. Certainly I don't think we should have an active free market in any drug. I think we're too liberal with alcohol. There are good models of more rational alcohol accessibility, like particularly Sweden. So in Sweden they have a state monopoly of alcohol. You have to think before you go and buy wine or spirits. The access is more limited than here. Swedes drink half what we drink, and they have a third of the harms of alcohol. So they have a very rational. In fact, the Swedish system is what we had when I was your age. Because when I was your age, people understood that alcohol was a drug, and the only people that could sell it were people that had a license, and also people who ran pubs or ran off licenses. And the reason we have so much liver damage from alcohol now is because we allowed alcohol to be sold in shops and supermarkets. And that has been a big transition. So I think we should have a regulated market for any drug that's less harmful than alcohol, including alcohol. And I think drugs like crack and heroin we should not make available. They should still be illegal. There's a question there.
In your opinion, what's the most dangerous legalized drug?
Well, alcohol, undoubtedly, for your age. As I say, the alcohol is going to be the drug that's going to kill. If you're going to die, as I say, about 4 or 5 of you are going to die before 60 as a result of alcohol. That's a fact. Yeah.
Is it true LSD stays in the spine?
Hmm?
Is it true LSD stays in the spine?
LSD stays in your spine? No, I don't think so. I mean, the LSD is a very interesting story. I mean, why LSD was made illegal wasn't anything to do with the harms of LSD. It was due to the fact that American youth were preferring to take it than go and kill Viet Cong. And it was just that decision was made simply because it was actually changing the way America thought about war. And the American, the American government itself didn't want LSD banned, but the military did, and so did the Drug Enforcement Agency. And so when you get a coalition of very powerful bureaucrats like that, they were even able to get that through in the face of opposition from Bobby Kennedy, who was the Secretary of State at the time. Yeah, and that's the problem with drug laws. And once a law's been made, it's much harder to unmake. Yeah, over there?
Has cannabis been leading to other uses of hard drugs since the prohibition of vaping?
Oh, the gateway question. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And so let me explain why the Dutch have cannabis coffee shops. Because they understood that cannabis could be a gateway drug in the sense that if you have to go to a drug dealer to get cannabis, the drug dealer is going to prefer to sell you heroin or crack than cannabis. So they opened up the coffee shops 25 years ago so that their young people could use cannabis safely without meeting drug dealers. And it was a massive success at many levels. They have much lower use of heroin than we have in this country. They have much less damage from alcohol. And they have relatively low levels of cannabis use. So this is absolutely the win-win situation. There is no evidence that if you get cannabis from a source other than a dealer, that it's a gateway drug. I mean, you know, the only real gateway drug where there's any real evidence is nicotine, which is that if you're smoking before the age of 10, then you've got much higher rates of going on to use drugs like heroin. But cannabis does not make you a drug addict. It's only it's the fact that you're actually going to illegal sources that encourages that. Over there?
Do you think drug related deaths would go down if they were regulated illegally?
Yes, I think they would, absolutely. So I think in a and we're seeing this already. So as you probably know, that 17 American states have made cannabis available medicinally. And medicinal cannabis, and 2 have made it legal recently. When cannabis is available medicinally, it tends to leak out into the more general use. And that's why, really, medicinal cannabis is available in the States, because Americans don't want to spend vast amounts of their tax money putting people in prison for cannabis offences. So they can't change the law, but they can make cannabis easily available through, if you've got a prescription. And in Colorado, the 5 years of making medicinal cannabis available has seen a 17% drop in deaths on the road from heavy drinking. So I think, absolutely, I think if there was an equal playing field between alcohol and cannabis, there would be, a lot of people would switch to cannabis from alcohol, and that would be many fewer deaths. And of course, the interesting thing, do you know what happened last night? What happened last night? The most remarkable change in the history of drug policy since 1961, when the drugs were made illegal, which was Uruguay made cannabis legal. So Uruguay is the first country in the world where cannabis is fully legal. It's a state monopoly. And it'll be a really interesting experiment, because we will be able to then see what happens when people have a choice. In the back? What illegal drugs have I taken? Yeah. When I was young, I took a bit of amphetamine, a bit of cannabis. That was it, really. I don't smoke. I've never smoked, so I've never really enjoyed that. Yeah, the question here? Yeah. Well, you've had one. Is there someone over here? Yeah.
Some of the causes of death must be multifactorial, like liver disease. Being one of those, I would assume. How can you be sure that the increase in liver disease is acutely due to alcohol? Could there be some effect, combination of drugs and alcohol that's causing the accident?
No, it's not. Those are the best estimates from the British Liver Trust. No, and in fact, what we know is what is even more terrifying than which is that in liver units around the country, and you may have seen this in the newspapers a couple of days ago, 1/3 of people presenting with liver disease, with alcoholic liver disease, are not even meeting the criteria for alcohol dependence. They're people like you and middle-class people like your parents who just happen now to drink a bottle of wine or half a bottle of wine a night all the time because it's easy, it's cheap, it's what people do. And that is the real burden of liver disease. It's not just young people binging. Young people binging sensitizes them, and then the middle-aged wealth allows them to sort of finally poison themselves. So no, it's almost that's 80% of that rise is just alcohol. I don't know.
That, with lung cancer as well, you can't necessarily detect if cannabis is causing that lung cancer.
So cannabis in lung cancer is an interesting question. So there are lots of reasons why cannabis is safer to the lungs than tobacco. The first is that it burns at a lower temperature, so it produces less toxins. The second is you go to countries where cannabis is widely used without tobacco, like Jamaica, then they don't have particularly high rates of lung cancer. In fact, the government did a study, which they won't report, but I'll tell you, They did a study because they were worried that when we took cannabis down from B to C, it might encourage people to smoke tobacco with their cannabis. So they did a study comparing the two. But cannabis is protective against the toxicity of nicotine. It's not something I would encourage you to do. I think if you're going to smoke cannabis, don't add nicotine at all. But there's a sort of safety aspect of cannabis. It's better to smoke cannabis and nicotine than nicotine alone. The other reason cannabis doesn't cause a lot of lung cancer is because most people don't want to smoke cannabis as much. I mean, the cannabis consumption on the day-by-day basis is less than that of nicotine because it's a different kind of drug. And also, most people's cannabis smoking careers are quite short. So most people get bored or they get paranoid after 5 or 10 years and don't carry on using it. Whereas when you're addicted to nicotine, it's really hard to stop. At the back there? Or another question? Go.
It's like obviously a huge social and political stigma with drugs in general and cannabis.
Yeah.
And everyone thinks that they're a lot more harmful than smoking and alcohol, just as that's how we think that is.
Yeah.
So what do you think the best way is to change that?
Well, lectures like this. You go and tell your parents. No, I mean seriously, you're right. Absolutely. I mean, there's been a systematic set of misinformation about the harms of drugs going back 100 years, and it's interesting to speculate why that is. It's partly driven by the drinks industry. It's partly driven by the tobacco industry. It's partly driven because there's political expediency. It's easy votes. People think there's a strange media antipathy to drugs. I mean, the reason the media hate ecstasy is the name. If it was called grunge, they wouldn't care. But the idea that people like you might be ecstatic when they've never been so is very disturbing to journalists. It really is. Do you have another question?
Isn't there a monetary incentive for the government to research some of the drugs that you spoke about? Because you spoke about treatment of PTSD.
Yeah.
So wouldn't that in the future develop more cost-effective or
Of course, absolutely.
So why isn't that?
Because they're stupid. And because the people that make the decisions about the drug laws are in a department called the Home Office, which has no interest whatsoever in health. Now, we're one of only 2 countries in the world in which the decision making about drugs is given to people who are interested in penalising people. In almost all other countries, drugs are in health rather than crime. And we're just archaic and primitive in that sense. Yeah.
If you're Prime Minister, would you legalise or decriminalise cannabis?
Well, I decriminalise all drugs. There's absolutely no point in having criminal sanctions against drug users for 2 reasons. The first is, as I've said before, that if you're just an ordinary drug user, the effect of a criminal record is going to be much more damaging to your life than the drug. And then if you're an addict, then criminalising someone for being ill is inhuman. And so there is no justification for criminalising users at all. And in fact, we only brought in criminal sanctions for drug users in the 1971 Act. There was no reason for it. It was a bizarre thing to have done. And politicians who were around before then say to me, I don't know why we did it. It was odd, but we did it. And now we've reaped the benefit, the whirlwind of the consequences. Criminalisation is the worst thing you can do to anyone. There's only one person I know whose career has profited from a criminal record, and that was a guy called Nick Coulson. But that was just a transient thing, and we'll see what happens when they finish his trial now. Yeah.
What is the meaning behind the name of the lecture and the book?
Oh, drugs in the hot air. Yeah, so, it's interesting. So this book was, I was approached by a publisher his first book they'd done was called Renewable Energy Without the Hot Air, which is a clever pun on renewable energy. So they said, well, why don't you do drugs without the hot air? So I thought it was quite, that's hot air and all the sort of, the hysteria that goes around drugs. I thought it was quite clever. But you're kind of right, it doesn't translate very well, and people in other countries think, what the hell is he talking about? Is it smoking? And that's it. The interesting thing about the other book is that the guy that wrote the other book is now the government's chief advisor on renewable energy. So I'm waiting to see if the same thing will happen to me. But at the back there. That is a really interesting question. So the truth is this. The truth is that so if you just take cannabis as a special example. So cannabis was legal around the world, effectively until 1961. But the attack on cannabis came at the end of American Prohibition. So you know American Prohibition on alcohol was 1923 to about 1930. And because it created so much organized crime, the American government created and because all the police were corrupt, and they were corrupted by the crime, they created a separate internal army, which we now call the Drug Enforcement Agency, to be independent of the police to fight prohibition. And that was run by a guy called Harry Anslinger, who became the second most powerful person in the USA because he had this army of like 35,000 people fighting the mafia. He was famous, he was important. Then prohibition was stopped, and he was going to lose his empire and his power. And he didn't want to do that, so he decided that there had to be another threat, and that threat was cannabis. They changed the name to marijuana because they wanted to focus on Mexicans and marijuana, Mexico. And they created this myth that marijuana was a dangerous drug, that Mexicans were coming across the border, they were getting stoned on marijuana, or they were raping white women, they were giving it to young men who were just beating their mothers up. They made a whole series of bizarre films about the harms, marijuana madness, etc., reefer madness. And they persuaded the US government that there was a problem, so the DEA were able to keep funding. And then eventually they persuaded the world that it should be illegal in the UN conventions in 1961. So it's essentially been an economic desire by the Drug Enforcement Agency to keep going. And you say, well, why do we fall in? And because we do what the Americans tell us, we always have. And hopefully it'll change at some point. But I mean, why we just ban cat? Because the Americans want us to ban cat. You know, why do we fight in Iraq? Because, I mean, basically, pretty much what the Americans say, we do. It's just a question of how high we jump when they tell us to jump. Sad. The one country that stood up to them was the Netherlands, who said, well, that's ridiculous. We want medicinal cannabis. It's been a medicine for thousands of years, and they carried on using it. But they fought. You know, the Americans continually tried to close down the cannabis cafes, but the Dutch had the courage to stand up to them. Any other? No? Yeah?
So you're saying there's no negative effects of cannabis at all?
I'm not saying that. Did I say that?
No, as in, like, on a person, because there's been studies that...
No, of course not. No, now let me make one thing very clear. There is no such thing as a safe drug. It's impossible. It's impossible to change your brain and not possibly have bad effects. Of course it's not. All I'm saying is that drugs differ in their extent of harm, and there is no relationship between the harms of drugs and their classification. Classification is arbitrary. It's driven by historic political factors, not by science, and that should change. But, and I would say this to you, if you're going to use drugs, know what the harms are, and then make a reasoned decision. And I think the worst thing of all, and I feel very strongly about this, having 4 kids of my own and seeing, a lot of other children go through this teenage years. The worst thing of all is to take a drug that harms you when you think you're taking something else. And current prohibition, particularly around legal highs and drugs like ecstasy, encourages that. And we've had about 40 deaths in Britain from this drug PMA in the last 2 years. It is completely unnecessary. The drug exists simply because we have this ridiculously punitive approach to drugs like ecstasy. And every one of those deaths is an insult to the way in which we manage science and evidence in this country, and we really should do something about it.
David, I think at this point we're up to our session in this theatre, so perhaps we could say thank you to you.
Thank you to you. Thank you.